This is the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Kendall of the notaballerina.com travel blog. Every episode I'll share travel tales from several fellow travel lovers, and together we hope to entertain and inspire you, remind you of some of your own great travel experiences, and encourage you to hit the road again soon. Hello and welcome to episode 280 of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. It's about Western Australia, thoughtful travels in 2022. Before I get started, I'd like to pay my respects to the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation where I'm recording this podcast, but also to the people of the various Indigenous countries all across Western Australia where I've had the great fortune to travel this year. So regular listeners know every 10 episodes I do something a bit different rather than having my regular array of guests on. And so this time I'm going to be talking about some of the many trips I've taken around Western Australia during 2022. I'm super lucky that I get sent around WA by the Tourism Council to run social media workshops for tourism businesses. It's great fun to have the chance to experience different places, and I always get to meet interesting people. They're always tourism related people, and I think they're often the extra interesting ones. So during this episode, I'm going to be chatting about a few of these trips, and of course doing so, I guess, with a bit of a thoughtful travel lens. In this case, with these travels closer to home, I think that's things like trying to connect with the local people in a place I visit, looking at some of the lesser known history, being spontaneous, not over planning, and trying not to cram too much into a day. I'm not always perfect at that last one on work trips. I don't usually have heaps of extra time. I always try and have an extra day or so, but I usually have to get back and do other kinds of work, etc. So don't always have the luxury of being a really slow traveller, but I do try and slow down as much as I can. So that's what this episode is all about, and I'm going to kind of just run through 2022 and my thoughtful trips around Western Australia, basically in chronological order. So let's go.
Have a great flight.
That's the sound of my first plane trip of the year. In fact, it was my first plane trip since early 2020. Thank you, pandemic. I still wasn't leaving the state. I'm not sure if I could have then or not. I've lost track of how our border controls went. It seems kind of so long ago now, even though it was only earlier this year that we still had restrictions. But in any case, that was me taking off to head north to Broome. And Broome is just a beautiful, beautiful, amazing part of WA. It's been quite interesting, thanks to the pandemic, that a lot of local Perth people who would usually go to Bali for their regular holidays have been heading to Broome instead when they couldn't get overseas. In any case, I've already prattled on about Broome in an earlier episode. So if you want to know more about my time in Broome, head to episode 273, and I'll leave a link in the show notes too. But it is a fabulous part of the world. But one thing I just wanted to mention while I'm sort of summarising these travels was that one of my really favourite parts of that trip was meeting up with my school friend Simone, who works in the justice system up there, and she could tell me a lot about what life there was really like. And I saw Sim again recently, just last month, at our high school reunion. Really scary, our 30th high school reunion. That's crazy. And that reminded me that I actually wanted to highlight a social good not-for-profit organisation that she's been involved with up in Broome for many years. So it's called Feed the Little Children, and it provides meals to local children in need. And I've been hearing about it from Simone for many years, and I thought I'll just get an update from her because I know that they were having some troubles, and so she just messaged me to say she's still seeking, or they are still seeking, ongoing funding. They're still reliant on public donations and love to have travellers along on the food runs. So if you're in Broome, get in touch with Feed the Little Children, and you might be able to help them out actually, on the ground. But otherwise, you can also head to their website at feedthelittlechildren.org.au if you want to make a donation. So just a plug for that, because I know, firsthand from Simone what good work they do. Now, my next trip wandering Western Australia for for work during 2022 was down south. So here in Perth, we refer to the region kind of around 3 hours south as down south. Everyone knows exactly what that means in Perth. There was this move to try and shorten that, or I don't know if it was just it popped up in the media a few times to call it Douth instead of down south, but I don't know anyone who says that, thank goodness. Anyway, it includes towns like Margaret River and Busselton, which you probably know a bit about. And you would have heard me talk about down south in my Cape to Cape hiking episode. If you haven't, then have a listen to episode 276, where I had a long chat with Catherine about our hiking week on the Cape to Cape track. But what you hear a lot of down south is this. So that was the wind and waves at Wannerup Beach, just north of Busselton. So I ran some workshops in Busselton back in June this year, and I've been to that area so many times. I often go and visit friends. In fact, on that trip I was meant to catch up for a lovely dinner with two friends I hadn't seen in ages. And of course, fate intervened, and both of them, although they hadn't seen each other, both of them came down with COVID that very week. So I had a bit more free time. And anyway, while I was there, I wanted to find things I'd never seen before. You know, it's an area I visited lots of times. And so I kind of did a bit of internet rabbit holing, and I found a spot, or something that jumped out at me was Wannerup Beach, because it was mentioned in connection to a massacre of the local Indigenous Wadandi Noongar people back in 1841, and I'd never heard about it, and I wanted to know more, and why didn't I know, and what happened? So I'll actually include a link in the show notes to a really interesting report. It's from an ABC report, but also beautifully put together with, it's a really multimedia digital video and image report. Just really interesting as well. It's a story of, you know, some of what happened and why we don't know much about it and so on. So I did post about it on Instagram at the time, and a few friends who live or work in the region had definitely said they'd heard about this massacre and so on. But it's definitely the kind of history that I think we really do need to know more about. So I'd done, you know, that kind of reading, and then when I left Busselton to return to Perth, I took a short detour to that area and, you know, had a look around and had a think, I guess. I guess that's a thoughtful travel approach. So I think it's important to realise, it was an important thing to me to be reminded that even when I've been to a place many, many times, there's often more to discover, and sometimes some really important things. So that was Busselton. Now, later that same month, in June, earlier this year, I went down to Albany. Now, there are no flight sounds for this trip, no audio of the flight, because I was not videoing or audio recording anything. It was literally the scariest flight of my life. So maybe I've been lucky, but this was, it was the worst experience I've had. We were on a tiny plane during a storm, and the pilot tried to land in Albany, but had to abort that landing just before we got down to the runway. So up we went again, and then he had to fly us around again and approach from another direction, all with the worst turbulence I've ever experienced. You know, the full white knuckle clinging to any part of the seat I could. Ugh, I don't want to go through that again. It was very unpleasant. I'm a bit of an anxious flyer anyway, but sometimes it's the only way to get places. I was very pleased on the return flight to see that we had clear weather and that I haven't had to go on such a small plane since, because I will not be happy when I do. But anyway, we survived. And while I was down in Albany, I got to hear this. So that is the sound of the waves at Middleton Beach in Albany. It was the middle of winter, and Albany is a cold place by Western Australian standards, but there were quite a few swimmers there early in the morning. I think they're crazy, but I believe and I've heard it's really good for you, but I really found it often I didn't find it warm enough in summer when I was a kid because it's on the south coast of WA, it's like next stop Antarctica. So the water is, I think, freezing. Anyway, that was Middleton Beach, and Albany in general is a really special place to me. I've had many trips down there, especially in my teens and early 20s when my grandmother lived there. That's the grandmother who's responsible for the Not a Ballerina name of my website. If you don't know that story, just head to my website about page and you'll understand. So it's a really special place, but I hadn't been there for, more than a decade since my grandmother passed away. And it was really wonderful to return and see what's changed. I kept meaning to go, but, it's too far for just a weekend usually, so I hadn't got there. But it was, really great to see it. Albany's a beautiful place, a beautiful town. If you get the chance to go, just do it. It's so gorgeous. One of my favourite things to do there this time was I visited the National Anzac Centre for the first time. It's a super impressive museum. It opened back in 2014, so relatively new, and just really well put together, really interesting, a great location. I'll put a picture in the show notes of one of my favourite parts, which is a sculpture of a soldier offering water to his horse, and this sculpture kind of fills a room, and this room hangs off the hill and overlooks the harbour. It's, just something special, and the quotation at the bottom of that, or the inspiration for that sculpture perhaps, is just a line from a soldier saying, "Sharing the last of the water with my old mate, he deserves a drink as much as I do before the charge." So it's a sombre place, but a really, really educational place in a really interesting way. And I'm always keen to see that kind of stuff. It's important. So Albany, beautiful spot. Now, my final destination around Western Australia this year was to go north to Geraldton, just relatively recently in October. Now, I thought I'd never been to Geraldton, but my dad corrected me and he said that we must have driven through there when I was 8 on the way to a family holiday in Kalbarri. So I believe him. Actually, funnily enough, on that Kalbarri trip, I kept my first ever travel diary. I think I've mentioned it in an episode long ago. I still have that travel diary, but strangely, Geraldton didn't rate a mention. I reckon as an 8-year-old, I wasn't sure how to spell it, so I didn't include it. That's my guess. But anyway, I got up to Geraldton and, for all intents and purposes, it was my first visit there. And luckily, I was able to arrive really early on the morning before my day of workshops. So I had a really early flight up. Unfortunately, it was a Monday morning and I hadn't sort of factored in the fact that at the airport it would be absolute chaos, full of people going back up north for their working week. So FIFO, fly in, fly out workers. There were people in high-vis clothing everywhere. It was chaos. It wasn't chaos, actually. It was just very, very busy. But those are people who fly really frequently, every week or every fortnight. So they were actually very good at flying. They were, good at going through security quickly. So it was all fine in the end. But I was like, oh my goodness, I have never seen Perth Airport so full. So got up to Geraldton. I wanted to make the most of that day. I had most of that day free, which was fabulous. I just had a client call in the middle of the afternoon. But otherwise, I wanted to do kind of a bit of traditional sightseeing, I suppose, to get a feel for what Geraldton had to offer, what it's all about. So it's a coastal town as well, and, a relatively big one in Western Australia. And my favourite spot was easily the memorial to the HMAS Sydney 2. So that was a ship that was lost at sea without a trace, basically, in 1941, lost off the WA coast. And it was only located by an expedition relatively recently, 2008. I'll put a link in the show notes to some museum info about all of that because it's really interesting. So the memorial is on a hill overlooking both the water and the town of Geraldton, quite a few different components to it. And I made sure I planned my trip to coincide with the daily tour there that's given by local volunteers. I often find that those kinds of tours are really fascinating, and this was definitely no exception. The guy who led us had been very heavily involved with the memorial for decades, before it was built and during its construction and ever since. So it was really absolutely fascinating. It's full of interesting symbolism, beautiful sculptures and artwork, and really just an impressive place. It was blown away really. And then I spent the rest of the day walking as much as possible in Geraldton, in the town itself. Walking, definitely the best way to get to know a place, isn't it? So I had a high step count, but also I was pretty happy. There was also a kind of a surprise was the cathedral. So there's this, I think pretty large and pretty impressive cathedral there, the St. Francis Xavier Cathedral. And I walked into that and it sounded like this. Yeah, so I walked into this amazing cathedral and some person was there practicing the organ. There wasn't anything happening and their organ playing wasn't perfect, which was kind of nice. So that's what I had there. And then I wandered back to my hotel. But the extra craziness, the bonus craziness, I suppose, about my Geraldton trip was I got to catch up with a friend from Victoria. So my friend Jean, I first met her in Bangkok quite a few years ago at a TBEX travel blogging conference. And Jean's working in a completely different industry, but in this crazy coincidence, she was running an expo in the very same hotel where we both stayed and where my workshops were running. In fact, her expo took place the day after my workshops, actually in the same room. So this was by complete coincidence. She flew in from Melbourne to up to Geraldton, and we'd actually realised this crazy coincidence before our trips because she'd said, "Hey, I'm coming to WA, but I won't be able to see you because I won't be in Perth." And I said, "Where are you going?" And she said, "Geraldton." And I said, "When?" And how is it possible? It was the same dates. Insane. But so we'd figured that out and we were able to make full use of it and catch up for several meals. And I love that about travel. Gives you friends all over the place, and sometimes those friends can end up where you don't expect them to be, and you get to catch up and reminisce and talk all things travel. So it was great to see you, Jean, and I hope that I get to see you in Victoria soon, actually, hopefully next month. So that was one of those, really crazy things. Now, another one of my favourite ways to be a thoughtful traveller is to be spontaneous. So I had no plans for my final day in Geraldton after my workshops had finished the following day before I had to fly home. No plans. I just, like to leave it open. And often when I'm running those kind of workshops with tourism businesses, I get ideas from the people I meet. But in this case, the idea came via a text message and a phone call from my dad. In fact, he kept trying to call me. I think he called a couple of times while I was running workshops. And what it turned out was he'd realised I was nearby to a place where he lived in 1941. And so he texted me this hand-drawn map explaining where he'd lived, sort of, 3/4 of an hour south of where I was. And he, said, if I've got time, why don't I go and check it out? And I did. So I checked out of my hotel early that morning and headed a bit south. And my dad had explained that he had lived in this small home in a row near the harbour area of Greenough, a bit south of Geraldton. It's a beautifully scenic spot on the water, and where his home used to stand in a row with other houses, all of it is just grass now underneath an obelisk. It's it's just grass near the harbour, but it was quite surreal to kind of wander around there and imagine my dad as a 4-year-old. So it's a long time ago, as a 4-year-old, being in that very place. It's insane, but really cool. And that's the kind of thing that, I love that I had the chance to do something like that. I called my dad while I was there and FaceTimed him. And so he was like, yes, that's the spot. And there we go. So a little piece of family history that I didn't know before. So I hope that this episode has given you a few ideas. Maybe you also travel in this way, or maybe when you travel for work, you kind of focus on your work, but there might be times when you can take time out. Or if you travel ordinarily, perhaps some of the ideas that I kind of try and use to be a more thoughtful traveller might give you, some ideas of different things you could do when you travel as well. I don't know, but hopefully it's been interesting and useful. So thank you for listening to episode 280 of the Thoughtful Travel podcast. I've got a bunch of links to share with you, so they'll be in the show notes. And of course, the show notes for this episode will be at notaballerina.com/280. There'll also be some info in our Facebook and LinkedIn groups. So have a look for Thoughtful Travellers in Facebook or LinkedIn, or see the links in the show notes. And the other things I'm going to leave in the show notes are links to the Broome episode 273, links to the Cape to Cape hiking episode 276, and some of the resources I've mentioned during this episode. So ABC report about the Wannerup massacre, a link to the National Anzac Centre in Albany if you want to have a look about that museum and see what's there, a link to Feed the Little Children Inc., which is feedthelittlechildren.org.au, and a link to the WA Museum's information about the HMAS Sydney 2 as well. So some interesting things, I think. Western Australia is, this faraway place for many of my listeners, and perhaps I've given you a little taste of it. And for my local listeners, I hope that there's been something new in it there for you as well. As always, thank you so much for listening. This has been another episode of the Thoughtful Travel podcast. Show notes and other information are at notaballerina.com/podcast. Join me again soon for another chat about why we travel. Bye for now.